Trump may be having a change of heart on 3 of his signature campaign promises.
Yeah, today he appeared to soften his stance on prosecuting Hillary Clinton for the emails, using torture on terror suspects, and calling climate change a hoax.
KCAL 9 political reporter Bryan joins us now for more on the revelations that came during a pretty lengthy interview with New York Times reporters today.
Absolutely. Who would have thought of it? And you know, it's Donald Trump not the only one who has changed his mind on some issues. I mean, a lot of candidates and president-elects do that. But he was so adamant on these subjects. Big changes tonight on some of the key issues in President-elect Donald Trump's campaign. Trump met for an hour with officials from the New York Times, and Times reporters who also attended the meeting tweeted out Trump's responses to some of the questions where his answers sounded very different from his campaign rallies. For months, the Donald Trump campaign crowds, prompted by his furious attacks on crooked Hillary Clinton, screamed, "Lock her up." It was a centerpiece of his campaign rallies. But on Tuesday, Trump, pressed by the New York Times if he has definitely ruled out prosecuting Hillary Clinton, said, "It's just not something that I feel very strongly about. I think it would be very, very divisive for the country." Trump campaign manager Kellyanne Conway urged other Republicans to follow suit.
I think when the president-elect, who's also the head of your party now, Joe, tells you before he's even inaugurated he doesn't wish to pursue these charges, it sends a very strong message, tone and content to the members.
After Trump's fiery meeting Monday with TV news anchors and executives, his meeting on Tuesday at the New York Times didn't come easily. First, he fired off this tweet. "I canceled today's meeting with the failing New York Times when the terms and conditions of the meeting were changed at the last moment. Not nice." Then he showed up for the New York Times meeting anyway. And when asked does he think human activity is linked to climate change, he said, "I think there is some connectivity, something. It depends on how much." But during the campaign,
a lot of it's a hoax. It's a hoax.
Trump also suggested he wants to be the president who finally hammers out a workable peace settlement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, calling on his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, an Orthodox Jew, one of his closest advisors, to play a key role in the mediation. Kushner has been very active behind closed doors with the transition. And on the issue of using torture tactics on terrorism prisoners, Trump said this during the campaign.
I would bring back waterboarding, and I'd bring back a hell of a lot worse than waterboarding.
But on Tuesday, Trump told the Times he changed his mind after a conversation with General James Mattis, who's under serious consideration for defense secretary. Mattis told Trump he could do better getting information from prisoners if he had a pack of cigarettes and a couple beers to offer them. Trump said he was impressed by that.
Hail Trump! Hail our people! Hail victory!
Trump was also asked about the support he's gotten from white nationalists, many of whom rallied with Sieg Heil Nazi salutes in Washington last weekend, a movement that some critics are tying to Trump strategist Steve Bannon, whose Breitbart website is popular with the nationalists. Trump told the Times about the white nationalists, "I don't want to energize the group, and I disavow the group." And when asked about his business conflicts, Trump said, "The law's totally on my side. The president can't have a conflict of interest." But not everyone agrees. Trump opened a billion-dollar golf resort on the coast of Scotland in 2012. But when a wind farm was built offshore, Trump was not a happy camper because he felt it ruined the view and diminished the value of the resort. So shortly after his election, when he met with Brexit movement leader Nigel Farage, a British politician, did they talk about outlawing the wind farm? "I might have brought it up," Trump told the Times.
Whether a position is abused or there's just the potential for that abuse, there's just the opportunity to abuse it. Either way, it's undermining of confidence in government.
And with that, there were cheers and boos as Trump left the New York Times building and headed to Florida to spend Thanksgiving with his family. Also tonight, Donald Trump has asked Dr. Ben Carson to consider taking the job of Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. And CNN is reporting that Mitt Romney is seriously considering taking the job of Secretary of State, although it's not entirely clear that that job has been offered. So a lot of things, a lot of moving parts still as we head into Thanksgiving.
Yeah. Dave, I want to get your input on this. A CBS poll came out today that showed that 59% of those people polled said that Trump should shut down his Twitter because of some of the remarks that he said just within the last few days. Your thoughts on that? Should he take a look at not using social media?
Well, I mean, far from me to recommend what he should or shouldn't do, but I have a feeling he may not be getting rid of Twitter. So far, Trump is showing no sign that he's going to back off on using Twitter and Facebook when he becomes president, and why should he? Social media allows Trump to communicate directly to tens of millions of Americans without having to go through the mainstream media, which he often sees as the enemy. Social media was so pivotal in Trump's amazing upset in the presidential election that I think it's fair to say he might not have won the White House without them. So I think he'll be extremely reluctant to drop them. And beyond Trump, it looks like social media could be the most important communicative tool that political leaders will have for decades to come, Jeff.